Hello. About 100 years ago, the discipline of philosophy seemed split into two main camps. One is known today as the analytic school, the other as the continental. The founders of the analytic tradition, who included Bertrand Russell and Ludwig Wittgenstein, believed it should be as impersonal and exact as the sciences. For them, it was logic and language, rather than human experience, that would answer the important questions. Continental philosophers, such as Martin Heidegger, on the other hand, rejected this approach, and commonly they were not just using different methods, but asking different questions. For much of the last century, philosophers have been categorized as either analytic or continental, and there have been some bitter exchanges between the two camps. But what are the differences between them? How deep a divide really exists, and could the two traditions ever reunite? With me to discuss the continental analytic split are Stephen Mulhall, Professor of Philosophy at New College, University of Oxford, Beatrice Hahn-Pyle, Professor of Philosophy at the University of Essex, and Hans-Johann Glock, Professor of Philosophy at the University of Zurich. Stephen Mulhall, let's start with the analytic tradition. When did it begin and who were its founding figures?
It began in the early decades of the 20th century in Cambridge, when Bertrand Russell and Ludwig Wittgenstein put to very creative philosophical use a revolution in logic that was, in effect, brought about by the work of Gottlob Frege, a German. And it really was a revolutionary development in logic. The tools that Frege came up with allowed logicians to clarify and provide a sort of formal presentation of much more complex forms of reasoning and much more of the internal logical complexity of the propositions that we use in reasoning. Can you
give us a taste of what that was?
Well, for a long time before Frege, logic was built around a basically sort of Aristotelian model where subject-predicate structure, which was very close to the ordinary surface grammar of language, was taken to be the main model for logical structure. What Frege did was use some concepts that he took primarily from mathematics, a distinction between function and argument, which has a specifically mathematical significance when one's interested in numbers. And then he generalized the notion of a function and used that to represent predicate structure in ordinary propositions. And what that allowed him to do was to capture forms of reasoning and forms of structure in propositions, particularly ways in which we use general ideas of generality, in a way that wasn't possible with the resources of Aristotelian logic.
So where did Russell and Wittgenstein and others, but let's stick with them because otherwise we'll get too cluttered up with names, where did they take it?
What they did with it was apply it to specifically philosophical problems. Frege's primary concern was a project of his to try and reduce mathematical propositions to logic. Russell was also interested in that, but he had a much more general eye for philosophical problems. And what he used the resources of Fregean logic to do was to show that many of the problems that philosophers had grappled with for a very long time were generated by the surface appearance of propositions in ordinary language, where, for example, one has expressions in ordinary sentences which look as if they're working in the way names do, picking out objects in the world. Well, the classical example that Russell used was of the following proposition: the present King of France is bald. The problem with that sentence is that the present King of France looks like it's a name. It picks out an object in the world, and of course there is no object in the world corresponding to that name. So that created a problem about how one understands the meaning of the sentence.
You mean because there wasn't a King of France?
Yes, that's right. Yeah. The question is, how do you give meaning to names? How are they supposed to be functioning if there's nothing in the world corresponding to them? And what the resources of Fregean logic allowed Russell to do was to show that there's a way of presenting the structure of that proposition which removes the appearance that there's a referring expression in the proposition.
In the mid-30s, to park Cambridge for a moment, the logical positivists arrived. They'd arrived already, but please excuse my simplicity, right? That can be the motto for this programme. There's a group called the Logical Positivists in Austria. Can you briefly tell us how they took up or developed the analytic case?